for the preaching this morning, so bear with us if we have technical difficulties. Our gospel reading today is from Luke chapter 14, verse 1 and 7 through 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come to you and say, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. The word of God for the people of God. So social etiquette is kind of a big deal, and it changes a lot, and it changes quickly. Sometimes it depends on who you are with, and sometimes it depends on where you go. There have been books written about how we are supposed to behave and how we are supposed to act, especially when we are eating dinner with other people. These rules cover a lot of things, from how we should speak, the direction we should pass the food, which fork to use when, and whether or not it is polite to pass the salt shaker by itself. It's not, according to Emily Post. And that is only the beginning. There are a great many rules for parties and dinners. There are family rules, there are formal rules, there are casual rules, there are holiday rules, and there are everyday rules. We have rules for what we do as the host and what we do as guests. When we are guests, we want to be sure that we understand what is expected. Which fork are we supposed to use? Where do we sit? How do we address the host or other guests? For example, do I get to say Kate, or am I supposed to say Miss Thompson? And it seems that almost everywhere we go, the rules are a little bit different. Is this a gathering or a place where everything is formal? Or is this a place where casual is okay? Can I look at my phone? Do I need to bring a gift? And when we host, we worry about what to serve, who to invite, where to put our guests. Do we need to have seating tabs, so so-and-so doesn't sit by so-and-so? That's important. Sometimes we try to only invite the best of the best so we can be sure to impress. But more than we worry about who to invite, we sometimes try to figure out who not to invite. For whatever reason, we might not want someone to be there. Perhaps it's that one relative, we all have one, who doesn't really fit in, or who might bring up really awkward stories that are just going to embarrass everyone. Or maybe it's that neighbor or acquaintance who just doesn't fit in socially. They're just kind of awkward. Or perhaps it's the coworker who comes to eat but never brings anything and never invites you but always invites themselves. Maybe it's that person. There are lots of reasons we might not want to invite someone. Some of our reasons might be pretty good, and some might be pretty understandable. Others might be a little on the petty side. But the fact is, humans are social animals, and we spend a lot of time being the host and being the guest. I think we worry a lot about the right way to be a guest or the right way to be a host. Now, hosting a dinner party or a or a barbecue or a wedding might not seem like a big enough thing to warrant discussing it in church, but I'm going to argue that this is the best and most important place to talk about social etiquette. Jesus, and through Jesus, God is at one time both our host and our guest at every gathering I can think of. Church itself is evidence of that. We come into this building, we come here to find God and to meet God, to be in a place where God is calling us. In this place, we partake in communion, a feast that is filled with the bread of life and the cup overflowing with the new covenant given to us by God and is hosted by God. It's meant to fill the guests with life and hope and all the things we need to be a part of God's world. Yet, despite that feeling of coming into God's house, we spend a good part of our worship inviting God to join us, inviting God to participate in our lives and our very worship service. Every Sunday morning, every noon, and every night, we are invited to be both the guest of and host of God. I like to describe the role of being a Christian as being someone who wants to do more than learn about Christ, someone who wants to do more than study the teachings and lessons of Christ, but as someone who wants to learn and study Christ so they can learn to live into the mission of being Christ in the world. Basically, a Christian is someone who wants to be Christ-like. We get this wrong a lot. That's okay, because what we do next is really what's more important than what we did yesterday. There will be times where we ignore the invitation, and there will be times where we don't invite the right people to our parties. And since God is both guest and host, that means we are also both guest and host. We come to this building to worship here. We come to the communion table when it is time, not because we are perfect, not because we are the guest to impress, but because we are trying. We come because we understand that God has plans for this world, but more than plans, God has hope for this world, and we hear God calling us and inviting us to be a part of those plans, to be a part of that hope. We come not because we are already perfect and ready, but because we want to be better. We want to do better. And this is a place where we can find guidance, inspiration, and even hope to be and do better. Normally, I try to be up here and I try to preach about the ways that we're doing all right and not necessarily our flaws, and not to draw attention to the things that make us not perfect. I try to avoid the parts that we hide. But for this, I think it's important. We have a personal relationship with God, and God has invited each and every one of us to be a part of this faith community. God invites us to a feast over and over again, filling us with hope and purpose. And despite all the times that we have missed our marks, despite all of the brokenness and imperfections that we carry with us, we are still invited. It is easy to be the guest of God. After all, you just have to walk through the door. You don't even have to dress up. You just have to show up. But being the host is a little harder. After all, who wants to invite God to their house? Anybody want to let God into your living room right now? I certainly do not. In our gospel reading this morning, Jesus reminds us that it is important to invite those with nothing to offer, those who are on the fringes, those who we perhaps would rather not sit next to. Jesus reminds us that being a good host means inviting everyone and not just those who might be able to return the favor, not just those who are worthy or higher up on the social ladder. In another gospel lesson, Jesus reminds his followers that whatever we do for the least among us, we do for God. Part of the call that God gives us is to become the host for others in the same way that God is the host for us. In the culture that we live in, we like to have pretty, fancy, and top-shelf things, to the point that we can sometimes forget to see the beauty and grace in the quiet and simple things. We worry about how others will see and judge us based on our clothes, our car, our houses, our front yards. So we try to avoid things and sometimes people that we feel might make us look like we are less than. We have the urge to only invite the cool kids to our parties. I wonder, do we avoid those on the fringes, those who are obviously broken, those who are not on the cool kid list, perhaps because we see our own failings and shortcomings more clearly when we look at them? But God, by offering each and every one of us grace, isn't something that we should think of as a gift, but rather as an example. If we truly want to follow in the footsteps of God or of Jesus, we must not only accept the invitation to the table, but also turn around and open the table up and extend the invitation to everyone else, both those who are on the cool kid list and those who are not. When we invite those in from the fringes, when we open up the table to all, even the people we don't like, we are opening the table up to God. God is at the same time host and guest, teaching and leading us through example about how we can extend the invitation as well as how we can accept a gift, the gift of love and grace, even if we are not worthy of it. God teaches us that we too can be both host and guest. Next week, we will be having communion together. Next week, we will take part in the holy feast that feeds our souls and our bodies. Next week, we will be guests at God's table. In what ways can we take what we have been given and share it with others? In what ways can we leave this place and God's table and become host to the rest of the world? Guest and host, host and guest. God is both, and so are we. In general, we don't like to be two different things at once. We find it hard to live in contradiction. After all, how can someone be young and old? Well, I'm young, but I'm also one of the oldest ministers in town because I've been here this much longer than the Methodist. How can we be happy and mad? Guest and host. It would be easier to be one or the other, but unfortunately God is challenging us to go the next step and be both. But unlike hosting a dinner or a party at our homes, this kind of hosting isn't about doing work and cleaning house and cooking and getting ready. This kind of hosting is about inclusion and sharing the good news, sharing the hope and faith that you have found by coming into this place, by taking a space at God's table. So don't worry, don't overthink it, and just start talking, start doing, start hosting. Open the doors for someone. Don't just walk past people, say hello, find out who they are. Find out how they are. This church hosted a funeral yesterday, and it was sort of a strange funeral because the person who passed away wasn't a member here. And none of his family was a member here. We hosted them because they came and they said, this building was really important to our son. Please let me have his funeral here. And I'm not going to say no. But it was a really strange funeral because there was no scripture, there was no singing, there was hardly any music. There was just a parade of people who came up here and talked about the person who had passed away. And the one thing they all said that really just struck a chord with me was that he couldn't walk by someone without saying hello. out, finding out if they needed anything, and then turning around and giving it to them if he had it, to the point where he bought a car from his brother, and before he paid for the car, he had turned around and given it to some person that he was an acquaintance with who needed a car so he could get to work to take care of his kids. That is an example of a person who is a host. That is what I'm not telling you to buy cars and give them away, but find out who the people are in your lives. Get to know someone new. Host them in conversation, not just in your house, but host them in life. Learn to find out who the people on the street are. So, if you have extra, share it. But don't be afraid to receive. But most importantly, invite someone in. Offer to bring them to this table. Welcome someone new, anyone, maybe everyone, to this party. Be the host and be the guest. Invite someone. Maybe they'll come. Our next hymn is Lord, whose love through humble service, which is number 503.